They thought it was just another routine stop. Two officers pulling over a lone driver on an empty stretch of highway. A chance to flex their authority, maybe give a warning, or worse, a ticket. But what they didn't know was that the woman behind the wheel wasn't who they assumed she was. And this wasn't going to go the way they thought. This stop? It was about to turn their entire world upside down. Before we dive into this jaw-dropping story, please let us know. Where are you watching from? We love hearing from you, no matter where in the world you are. And while you're here, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe. Your support helps us uncover stories like this that you won't find anywhere else. Alright, let's get into it. Victoria was driving down the long, winding highway, her car slicing through the early morning haze. It wasn't the kind of morning you expected trouble, not when the horizon was painted in soft oranges and yellows, and the air smelled of dew-soaked grass. But trouble doesn't send invitations. It just shows up unannounced. As the blue and red lights exploded in her rearview mirror, Victoria's stomach dropped, not because she was doing anything wrong. Her speed was steady, her seatbelt was fastened, but because she'd been here before. Too many times, in fact. The siren screamed behind her like a warning, the kind that sends chills crawling down your spine. She pulled over slowly, her heart pounding louder than the engine. The cruiser stopped behind her, and two officers stepped out. They moved like they owned the world, their posture rigid, their expressions unreadable. The older one, broad-shouldered and grizzled, walked with the confidence of someone used to being in charge. The younger one trailed behind, his smirk practically oozing with cockiness. Victoria stayed still, her hands resting on the wheel. She didn't need to check her mirror to feel their gazes burning into her. The older officer leaned down, his face level with her window. "License and registration," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut through the morning air. Victoria nodded, reaching into the glove compartment. She kept her movements slow, deliberate. You didn't survive situations like this by being careless. The officer scanned her documents, his brows pulling together ever so slightly. He said nothing, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was calculating. The younger officer took a step closer, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Where are you headed this early?" he asked, his tone friendly, but not the good kind of friendly. The kind that hides suspicion beneath a thin layer of charm. "To work," Victoria replied simply, her voice calm. The younger cop tilted his head, his smirk growing. "Work? Around here? What kind of work, if you don't mind me asking?" Victoria could feel it. The assumptions, the judgment, the game they thought they were playing. She didn't rise to the bait. "Something important," she said, her tone giving nothing away. The older officer finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "Let's not make this complicated, ma'am." His words carried a quiet threat, one designed to remind her of exactly who he thought was in charge here. Victoria's pulse quickened, but she didn't show it. Not a flicker of doubt crossed her face. She had played this game before, and she wasn't about to lose. "You don't have to worry," she said, meeting his gaze with a calm confidence that made him pause. "You'll understand soon enough." That answer seemed to catch them both off guard. The younger officer's smirk faltered for a split second, replaced by something else. Curiosity? Uncertainty? Whatever it was, it made him hesitate, and that hesitation was everything. But the older officer wasn't ready to back down. "We've got all day, ma'am," he said, his tone hardening. "Why don't you tell us exactly why you're here?" Victoria didn't flinch. She could feel the tension thickening around them, could see the way their confidence wavered just a little. But she wasn't here to explain herself, not yet. "Like I said," she replied, her voice steady. "You'll find out soon enough." The older officer's expression hardened as the silence stretched between them. It wasn't the kind of silence he was used to. He was accustomed to stammering explanations, panicked apologies, or meek compliance. But Victoria wasn't giving him any of that, and it unnerved him. The younger officer stepped forward, clearly emboldened by his senior's quiet authority. He leaned in just enough for his smirk to twist into something almost mocking. "Look, lady," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "we're just trying to do our jobs here. So how about you stop playing games and tell us what you're really doing out here?" Victoria didn't bite. She stayed calm, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, her face betraying nothing. The older officer crossed his arms, his patience visibly thinning. "You don't seem to understand," he said, his voice low and deliberate, like he was speaking to someone who didn't quite grasp the situation. "We don't ask twice. Either you explain yourself right now, or we'll have to escalate this." That word, escalate, hung in the air like a storm cloud, thick and heavy with implied threats. Victoria's stomach twisted, but not from fear. She'd heard that word before, too many times. It wasn't new, and it wasn't scary. Not anymore. She finally broke her silence, her voice calm but firm. "And what exactly are you escalating?" she asked, her tone laced with just enough defiance to make the younger officer's smirk falter. "Driving on a public road? Is that a crime now?" The older officer's jaw tightened. "It's your attitude that's the problem, ma'am. You're making this harder than it needs to be." Victoria raised an eyebrow, her expression almost amused. "Harder for who? You?" The younger officer's face darkened, his confidence quickly morphing into frustration. "Look, we don't have to explain ourselves to you," he snapped, his voice louder now. "This is our job, and you—" He stopped abruptly as Victoria opened her door. Slowly, deliberately, the sound of the car door clicking open sliced through the air, sharp and unexpected. The two officers stiffened, their hands instinctively hovering near their holsters. "Stay in the car," the older officer barked, but Victoria was already stepping out. She stood tall, her posture calm but commanding, her eyes locked onto the older officers with a quiet intensity that made him falter. There was no aggression in her stance, no threat in her movements. But there was something else, something that made both men hesitate. "I don't think you're in a position to be giving orders," Victoria said, her voice steady and unwavering. The older officer blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "Excuse me?" Victoria tilted her head slightly, her gaze never leaving his. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" The younger officer snorted, his smirk returning as he tried to regain control of the situation. "Oh, I think we've got a pretty good idea." But Victoria didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound badge holder. She flipped it open with a casual flick of her wrist, holding it up for them to see. For a moment, the two officers just stared, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief. The older officer took a step closer, squinting at the badge as if he couldn't trust his own eyes. "Wait, what?" he stammered, his voice suddenly lacking the authority it held just moments ago. "That's right," Victoria said, her voice cool and confident. "I'm Chief Victoria Hayes. And unless you'd like to explain to your commanding officer why you thought harassing your new boss was a good idea, I suggest you rethink everything about how you've handled this situation." The younger officer's face drained of color. His smirk disappeared so fast it was as if it had never been there at all. "You're the chief?" he sputtered, his words tumbling over themselves in a frantic attempt to make sense of the situation. Victoria nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Surprised? Why? Because I don't look like the person you expect to be in charge?" The older officer opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of their mistake crashing down on them like a tidal wave. "You've got a lot to learn about respect," Victoria continued, her voice sharp but controlled. "And about assumptions. But don't worry, we'll have plenty of time to work on that. Because for the next few weeks, you'll be reporting directly to me. Every single day." The younger officer's jaw dropped, but he quickly snapped it shut, his face a mix of embarrassment and fear. The older officer nodded stiffly, his posture rigid as if bracing for impact. Victoria took a step closer, her presence commanding the space around her. "Let me make one thing clear," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "This department is about to change, and if you can't handle that, you're welcome to leave. But if you're staying, you'd better step up, because I won't tolerate this kind of behavior. Not today, not ever." She turned on her heel and walked back to her car, leaving the two officers standing there, speechless and stunned. As she pulled back onto the highway, Victoria allowed herself a small smile.